It is the penetrating question of the Christian faith. What about God and suffering? It is the question that led one chaplaincy intern at a children's hospital to admit that when Matthew, who was 8 years old, who had a bright smile and red hair and was full of life, died, that he had a one-on-one conversation with God, complaining to God, telling God it didn't make sense. It is the question that drove Susan Jacoby of the Washington Post to write after the tragedy in Haiti. Haiti is not a special case. There is no way to reconcile senseless suffering, whether caused by man or by nature, with belief in an all-powerful, benevolent deity. It's the theodicy problem, justifying and explaining the way of God. How does one explain the inexplicable or justify the unjustifiable? It is the question that caused Dr. Bart Ehrman, who is chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, to write a book called God's Problem. The question the Bible does not answer, why people suffer, and to admit in that book that question led him to give up his faith. Dr. Ehrman says, "The problem of excruciating pain and suffering in this world has haunted me for a very long time. It was what made me begin to think about religion when I was young, and it was what led me to question my faith when I was older. Ultimately, it was the reason I lost my faith altogether." What about God and suffering? Let me respond with 5 insights. First of all, we must accept that God allows suffering, even horrific suffering. We must accept that God does allow suffering, even horrific suffering. I don't believe that God causes specifically all the suffering that comes into the lives of individuals or into humanity, but there is no question but that God allows such suffering. It essentially is the classic theological equation that goes like this. Either God is all-powerful, omnipotent, or He is not. If God is all-powerful, which we believe He is, then nothing happens that He could not change or stop. If God is absolutely loving, which we believe He is, then out of love He could stop the suffering He has the power to stop. Thus, because suffering happens, God allows it. That means that you and I must accept that God allowed the extermination of 6 million Jews and 12 to 13 million ethnics at the hands of a madman in World War II. It means that you and I must accept that God allowed the earthquake and the corresponding tsunami in the Asian area that killed hundreds of thousands of people and left millions homeless. It means that you and I must accept that God allowed the earthquake and the tsunami in Japan in April of this year that killed 15,000 people, left 100,000 children homeless, and many hundreds of thousands of others homeless. There is no way around the fact that because God is omnipotent, which we believe, that one can avoid saying that He allows all suffering. If He is all-powerful, He could stop suffering. Because suffering exists, He allows it. That's the issue Job had. And so we find Job complaining in the midst of his own suffering to God with these words that I read earlier. "Today my complaint is bitter. His hand," meaning God's hand, "is heavy despite my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find Him, that I might come even to His dwelling. I would lay my case before Him and fill my mouth with arguments." Job feels rightfully secure in the thought that he can complain to God because God could have prevented his suffering. The second thing I would say this morning is we do God no favors by minimizing the question why. We do God no favors by minimizing the question why. I believe the human question why in the midst of great tragedy is an acceptable question. I know we Christians mean well when we say to persons, well, you shouldn't say that, you shouldn't ask that, you should leave that to God. But I want to say to you this morning that we do God no favors by seeking to prevent people from asking the very real human question, why? Which one of us wants to tell a parent whose young child suffers from some brutal cancer that he or she cannot ask the question, why? Which one of us wants to tell the survivors of the Holocaust that they have no right to ask the question, why? Which one of us wants to tell a young mother who is dying of cancer and who's going to leave young children on this earth that she has no right, or her husband has no right, to ask the question, why? Which one of us wants to say to a man or a woman in his or her 30s who discovers that he or she has Lou Gehrig's disease and is going to battle ALS for some time, which one of us would want to say to that person in his or her 30s, you have no right to ask the question, why? It's a very real human question. Now let me tell you something. I don't think God is offended by that question. I think the issue is our offense to the question, not God's offense to the question. You see, God made us the way we are. God made us as human beings with all sorts of feelings and emotions and responses, and so He fully understands our humanity in those moments that we cannot help but ask or even cry out, my God, why? We do God no favors. In fact, I think we diminish the witness of God when we seek to keep people from asking that very honest question. Thirdly, I would say we have to acknowledge that there is no satisfactory answer to the question of suffering here and now. I think we have to acknowledge there is no satisfactory answer to that question in the here and now. Most of you know that I've been a pastor for over 40 years, and I can tell you in that 40 plus years, I have seen almost all types and all levels of suffering. If you were to make a list of the types of suffering that human beings might go through, I can tell you that over these 40 plus years of ministry, I will have experienced almost every one of the types of suffering that you would have on your list. And let me tell you, when I go to someone who's in the midst of great suffering as a pastor, and they ask me that question, I want to be as spiritually comforting and theologically sound as I can, but I am honest with that person that I do not have the answer that will satisfy his or her soul or spirit to that question, why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this suffering? There is no pastor who can go to any person and tell that person that you absolutely have the answer to the question, why suffering is coming in your life. I'll tell you what I do tell. I tell every person who faces such suffering, don't believe God brought this on you. This is not suffering specifically brought upon you by God. And I believe that. I believe what one theologian said when he wrote, because persons want to have an answer to why the heartbreak and difficulties come our way in life, some believe that God chooses to bring particular suffering upon us. While I readily accept that God does allow the pain and heartache in our lives, I cannot see this loving and just God bringing to bear, particularly on the young, the vulnerable, the innocent, the kind of suffering so many face. Allow, yes. Specifically cause, no. Or like the way one Christian thinker responded to the issue in Haiti when he wrote, it's a simple and clear spiritual and theological truth. Deadly disasters happen. They wreak havoc on good folks and not so good folks, on saint and sinner alike. No one is specifically chosen and no one is specifically spared. We must remember that natural disasters are morally neutral. There is no answer to the question of suffering that in this life is fully going to satisfy everyone facing suffering, and it's surely not going to satisfy the critics of the faith, those who are already philosophically distant from God. Sometimes our attempts to answer that question do more to diminish again God's witness than to help it. I would say, fourthly, what we do have is the assurance that someday all these questions will be answered. What we do have is the assurance that someday all these questions will be answered. Remember how Paul puts it in the 13th chapter of the book of 1 Corinthians? For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. What we cannot comprehend now, we will know then. What answers we don't have now, we will have then. Someday the answers will come. Someday the answers will make sense. Someday all this seeming nonsensical suffering will be explained by God. But that depends on a certain conviction that you and I need to have. Do you believe God is absolutely good? Do you believe that God is absolutely just? Do you believe that God is absolutely fair? Do you believe that God is absolutely loving? Well, if God is absolutely good and God is absolutely just and God is absolutely loving and God is absolutely merciful, then that means that the answer that He gives someday to the difficult question of suffering has itself to be good and just and fair and loving. While we don't have the answer now, we will have the answer someday, and that answer will be good and fair and just and loving. If you read the book of Job again, from which I read earlier, you find God finally responding to the complaints and concerns of Job. And this is found in the 38th through 41st chapters of that book. But I like the way one modern thinker summarized God's response to Job, and let me share it with you. I have listened to you, Job, and I have allowed you to raise your objections. I won't condemn you for that, Job, but I want you to know that you cannot, in your finite mind and in your finite spirit, ever come close to understanding that which is eternal, that which is transcendent, that which is beyond your childlike reason. Job, it's too vast for your small mind. It's too deep for your simple spirit. Job, the answer you seek is beyond your ability to know, to understand, to comprehend. But Job, trust in my goodness, trust in my love, trust in my justice, and go forth in faith. And finally, I would say this morning that even as we suffer, God does not leave us alone. In the midst of our suffering, God is ever with us. Keep in mind again that I've been a pastor for over 40 plus years, that I've seen all types and all levels of suffering. But let me tell you something else I've seen. I have seen people with unbelievable faith and courage and hope in the midst of life's most difficult circumstances. I have seen people who have courage and faith and hope when you believe there's no way in the world, in the midst of that tragedy, that suffering, that heartache, that pain, that anyone could have faith and hope and courage and trust. But I've witnessed it as a pastor. And what that has said to me, if I didn't believe it otherwise, is that there is always God's sustaining presence in the midst of our difficulties. The first way God helps us is to sustain us. There is always power beyond your power, strength beyond your strength, hope beyond your hope in the midst of life's greatest difficulties. I believe that, and I think you do too. But let me tell you another way God helps us in the midst of our suffering. He brings people into our lives. Have you noticed that? That when you go through a great crisis in your life, people come your way. They nourish your spirit. They feed your soul. They inspire your hope. They help you believe that there is promise for the present and for the future. God sustains us, but God also brings people into our lives at the very moment we need them in the midst of our suffering. One person spoke to the tragedy in Haiti again in these words. Where do I see God in Haiti? I see Him in the call to love by people of many faiths and none. Hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of aid workers have poured into Haiti, the poorest nation in the hemisphere, no one's major trading partner and of strategic value to none, has become a top priority of government and individuals alike. You wonder where God is in Haiti. That's where God is. He's in the countless volunteers that have poured forth. He's in the millions of dollars that have come to help that impoverished nation. He's in the love that has been shown by people of all faiths or none who have made their way to that tragic place in order that it might be restored. You wonder where God is. God is in the midst of the compassion and the care and the love that has come forth. In the midst of our suffering, God is always present, sustaining us and bringing people of compassion into our lives. What about God and suffering? We have to accept that God allows all suffering, even horrific suffering. He is omnipotent. He could stop it. When He doesn't, He allows it. We do God no favors by minimizing the question, why? A question that doesn't offend God and shouldn't offend us. We have to acknowledge that there is no satisfactory answer here and now, but there is a just and good and loving answer to come beyond this life. And in the meantime, we are never, ever alone. There is strength, power, hope, and promise from Almighty God. Thanks be to God. Amen.